Chapter 3. Resolving Differences. Cappadocia was not a very peaceful country. 3 times in the last 20 years it had gone to war with one of its neighbours, the island of Cyprus. This was something of which Hermione was acutely aware, since the last war had only been 2 years ago, and British witches and wizards felt an extremely strong bond with the Cypriots. The Daily Prophet had run stories about the sufferings of the beleaguered Cypriots and the treacherous dealings of the Cappadocians. It was all very suspicious, since tiny magical Cyprus mostly spoke English and was dominated by several wealthy and influential wizarding families, while sprawling magical Cappadocia had few cultural bonds with Britain and considerably less money. Barbarians versus the elite made for good copy. Harry controlled the Prophet, she knew, so it was odd the paper had been so uncritical. She supposed he didn't micromanage. Actually, Hermione considered, since most Cappadocians spoke Greek as well as Arabic, they couldn't really be said to be Bavaros. That nasty term had been used by ancient Greeks to describe those who couldn't speak Greek. It was an onomatopoeia for what the Greeks had thought foreigners sounded like, ba. Maybe she could write a pseudonymous letter to the editor pointing this out the next time the country hit the headlines. Hermione gripped her broom tighter, increased her speed, and glanced around at the warband. Simon and Charlevoix were flying next to her, while Esther and Susan were below. Just above and behind her, Hiory and Jessie rode on their brooms, faces tight. She might need to write the letter soon. Somehow she thought Cappadocia would be in the news very shortly. She looked down at the ground racing by below. Stone pillars sprouted up from the wind-swept rocks below, the fairy chimneys. Tall and smooth, they studded the ridges and plateaus, looking for all the world like the frozen fingers of some trapped race of giants. They were natural formations, not ventiform, as the wind-whipped dust that swept past them might suggest, but worn away by years of cracking frost and whittling rain. Hermione looked away from them, leaned forward and squinted ahead. Those white hills there. Yes, they were close. She raised her right hand and gave the high sign, and Hiory and Jessie peeled away from the group, swooping along a different path. The fortress of Goreme, situated near the Turkish town of the same name, was protected in 3 ways. First, and most importantly, Goreme's existence was a secret. The best way to protect anything was to make sure that no one knows it exists. If you are unscrupulous and willing to use Obliviate, you could keep something very secret indeed. Second, Goreme was inaccessible. It had its beginnings in a cave complex used as a Christian church during the 11th century. The church remained, though it was now known as the Lemon Kelisse, to describe the sour feeling in the belly one experienced when visiting. The long and narrow passage through to the larger set of natural caves, on the other hand, had been erased by the butterball charm, which turned stone as soft as butter. Goreme was now surrounded by solid rock, and the depths of the fortress reached 200 meters beneath the dust of the surface. Third, Goreme was guarded by an army. The Exarchate of Cappadocia, which had no place in Muggle history, however important it might be to the course of magical events, did not station pairs of auras or teams of hit wizards. Goreme was military, and its dementors were weapons, and its guards were soldiers. Cappadocia was not unique in the wizarding world for possessing a specialized army rather than relying on policing forces or militia. While the Peace of Westphalia had established the idea of an explicit magical state, and the establishment of the International Confederation of Wizards pushed these states into formal organization, numerous personal fiefdoms persisted well past the end of the 19th century. It is true that political pressures, like the International Statute of Secrecy, and social pressures, like increasing education and Quidditch, did much to consolidate these pockets of autocracy into the same oligarchies that ruled much of the world. But, nonetheless, some modern oligarchies and all modern autocracies had standing armies. Truth be told, it would be difficult to say whether the Exarchate was dominated by the sitting strategos, or if the wealthy Secalarioi simply established new figureheads at regular intervals. Either way, it didn't matter to Hermione. Political reform of this, literally, Byzantine country was secondary to other concerns. The Cappadocians had Dementors, and they fed prisoners to those Dementors to keep them manageable, and that was not acceptable. Hermione pulled up on her broom, slowing down, and the rest of the group matched her deceleration. She came to a stop and pointed one finger at an uneven plateau of rock far below them. "There! Bubble up, everyone! But let's go!" The bubblehead charm sprouted from one nostril in its disturbing way, a single, small, translucent bubble swelling in the span of a breath until it encompassed her entire head. It wobbled a bit before settling into place. The other 4 witches and wizards did the same, ensuring they would have a supply of fresh and dust-free air. Alarms would be going off in Goreme about now. She didn't know exactly what their response protocols were, but they had an immense number of jinxes overlaid on the area. No apparating, no time-turners. There was an anti-disillusionment charm, a term which gave her linguistic heartburn. Further, there was a charm to prevent broomstick enchantments from functioning. It didn't extend to this height, so as not to betray their position to a chance passerby or intruding Cypriot, but all of these jinxes limited their ability to respond. They could certainly be turned off, but what use was a precaution if you dropped it at every moment of alarm? It was difficult to guess what they must be doing down there, deep underground, glued to their foeglasses. They had probably sent for aid. Were they confident that they were safe, unreachable, down under all that stone? Diffindo did a great deal of damage to rock, but it would take long minutes for such a small attack force to blast their way down. They didn't know enough to be afraid of 9.8 meters per second. Hermione reached into the pouch at her waist and groped around for a second. She felt her nails scratch into something and hoped she hadn't just damaged something important. It was one of the most annoying things about alicorn fingernails. Even if she kept them nightmarishly short, they could still accidentally scratch things if she wasn't careful. Super strength and claws might sound cool, but fingernails were definitely not designed to work like an animal's talons. It was embarrassing to accidentally ruin furniture, and it was annoying to pick the resulting detritus of stone, metal, or wood from where it would get embedded. When she found the sextant, she lifted it to her eye and sighted through the eyepiece. The bubble around her head jiggled under the pressure as it warped. She found the horizon and adjusted the declination of the index, clicking it along to the proper minute and second. She checked the measurement, then checked her watch, and lastly checked that she was directly over the big white rock. Then she clicked her wand right next to the aeronautical sextant's index bar and said quietly and repeatedly, "Finite." finite, 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 finite. She paused, then cast the spell 10 more times for good measure. Her targets were enormously large, but also rather far away. She'd probably missed with most of those. No reason not to be sure, since the spell took so little effort. She was cancelling her own magic, and so she cast the easiest and least powerful version of the spell and needed to put very little of herself into each iteration. There was a long pause before the first beam of depleted uranium hit the rock beneath them. Hermione could feel the impact in her inner ear as the roar of sound and air and dust blasted into the 5 mounted witches and wizards. They were quite high up, but then it was quite an impact. Harry had told her about the idea, gifted to him by science fiction. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, by Robert Heinlein. Her brain automatically supplied. Set high enough, the impact could have had the force of a nuclear weapon, but that would have required Muggle technology, which didn't work in the presence of magic, and it would have been overkill. The whole thing was complicated enough. It had initially proven impossible, no matter how exact they were and how many calculations they did, to actually hit the beams with a finite to end their hover charms. They'd tried attaching huge sheets to the beams to act as bigger targets, but they'd only acted as parachutes to drag the beams away from the necessary spot. The only way Harry and she could get it to work, after much experimentation, was to glue long threads of transfigured Teflon to their transfigured beams. The many threads were insubstantial, yet easy to hit. After the first beam hammered into the stone, once they knew it was working, but before the next one struck with their own blast of sand and dust, Hermione and the returned clumped together, and Susan cast a prismatic shield. They watched the next 4 beams hit in close succession. One was badly off target, but as far as she could see, it had missed to the north rather than to the south. Hermione was willing to destroy the Le Mans Colisée if she had to, but she'd rather preserve it. It was an excellent representation of Byzantine Christian architecture and art. The best Muggle bombs couldn't penetrate much deeper than 60 meters or so, even the ones currently under development, Harry had said. Well, nuclear bombs could do better, but that was out of the question. It didn't matter anyway. They didn't want to penetrate and murder everyone. They weren't trying to crush the wasp's nest. They were trying to shake it up enough so that all the wasps came out to play. Metal fell from the sky like the wrath of an angry deity. Each concussion had reached them even beyond the shield. Goreme was no hardened facility, like the Muggle military bunkers Harry had discussed with her with such pleasure. There was no anchoring or precautions taken against impact. It was essentially just a set of buildings constructed into natural caves. It would be very susceptible to some vigorous shaking. They waited a few minutes, remaining still and in place. After a while, a green bolt of light streaked out of the rock below. It went the wrong way and vanished into the sky, nowhere near Hermione or her returned. It had been shot blindly. A clever idea in its essence, undertaken by some desperate and vicious soldier, but the odds of a blindly aimed curse hitting them were microscopic. She noted the trick down in her memory for later consideration. Figures appeared on the ground below. 20 or 30, perhaps. The witches and wizards inside were using their portkeys to get outside to face the attackers who had just rattled them with a half-dozen serious earthquakes. An instant later, curses began pouring up and at Hermione and her tightly packed crowd of convenient targets. Susan dropped her shield without needing to be told, and they all separated and began dodging. Hermione had thought that the soldiers would be coming on brooms, but they didn't seem to have disengaged that jinx. Odd. That left them as distant infantry fighting an air attack. Perhaps they didn't feel threatened since the returned were high enough that neither side could really effectively aim. No, that didn't seem credible. They just had their secret military base smashed by mysterious metal rods from the sky. They would definitely be feeling threatened. A powerful attack or jinx that they were readying? Or were they just too rattled to get their act together? She shrugged and gave the high sign again. The returned began reaching into their own pouches, scooping out pots and dropping pot after pot. The pots were padded or altered in all manner of ways, the legacy of a school project that both Hermione and Harry had done when they were 10. Class, we're going to be trying to figure out how we might drop an egg from the roof without the egg breaking. Please look at the first page of your worksheet packet. There were some with small parachutes, some with inflated bladders, some with thick padding, and many others. To be honest, it probably would have been better to actually test these first and see which ones worked the best. Then they could have copied those. But this way had been much more fun. When Hermione had gone to Tesco for crafting supplies, Harry had given her a list as long as his arm, and she was fairly sure he'd spent all night on his 6 designs. Esther, on the other hand, had looked at them as if they were crazy and had just cast a charm. She'd been done with her 6 pots in 60 seconds. Philistine. Many of the pots smashed with great force onto the rock, seeming like some direct and pathetic bombardment. One landed directly on a wizard, but exploded into flinders and dust when it hit an active shield. A few others landed with such ease and grace that she bet they weren't even cracked, and so they had no effect. Others, though, were simply smashed open, and the young mandrakes that were awoken from their warm and comfortable napping in the dirt wailed in protest. It was a common Muggle-born trick, she had to admit. People who entered the magical world after growing up in the more safety-conscious, mundane life of Muggles were frequently astonished that there were so many dangerous spells, plants, and creatures, much in the same way that few pure-blood witches and wizards who'd seen the accident statistics could understand the use of automobiles. To the Muggle-born, it was immediately obvious that these deadly things could be used directly as weapons. She had read a dozen books about why this was a foolish idea. In the first place, the scream is easily warded by an adult witch or wizard. Further, they only scream when awoken, so you must awkwardly go to battle with a fairly obvious large container, making surprise difficult to achieve. Even further, mandrakes take most of a year to fully mature. Until then, their scream will merely cause unconsciousness. There were many other spells that could be cast that did not require most of a year preparation and a large flower pot, and which could not be blocked by numerous trivial charms. The plant had its uses, but the practical ones were almost universally as a potion ingredient. Mandrakes and chainsaws made poor weapons, and for much the same reasons. All of those caveats were true, and all of those scolding books were wise. But if you wished to attack from beyond wand distance, unexpectedly, and with the intention to stun, bombs away. Hermione had no intention of making this a fair fight. As long as you controlled the battlefield, you controlled combat, and she had come prepared for an aerial war. They had tricks upon tricks upon tricks. There were 1,000 different clever things one could do quite beyond normal magical dogfighting. If she could eliminate most of the enemy like this, before they'd even had a chance to take to the air, then this fight would be short and safe. They'd run out of mandrakes. Hermione peered down, squinting. From this vantage point it was hard to tell, but only 10 or 11 soldiers still seemed to be moving. It was time for falling. It was time for falling, apparently. Hermione's broom went dead as a stone between her legs. Ah, she mused, letting it tumble away from her fingers. That's why they didn't turn off the jinx. They were just working on making it stronger. Clever defense. She didn't know you could do that. 2 overlapping fields, perhaps, with one usually off. The wind whipped her robes against her face as she fell. How long? Seconds. Hermione reached to her wrist and slapped a bracelet there, hard. Never fight in the air without a backup. Beta Bastion not working. She slapped it again. It was a safety device meant for Quidditch, and it was supposed to be reliable, but she couldn't help but notice that she was still plummeting. She twisted in the air, scrambling for her wand and looking for one of the returned. There was no one. Getting closer to the ground now. A few seconds. No, there! Simon, if she could just... No, damn, where'd he go? There was Esther, but no, stunned. No. Have to move. Can you swim through the air? Turn. There he is, there, wand up, and yes, arresto momentum! He vanished from her sight, jerked away as his descent rapidly slowed. And that was the last thought Hermione had for some indeterminate amount of time. She could see. Her eyes had already been open, so she hadn't needed to do that. But she could see. They must have just healed. She felt nothing. That would be her spine. Broken. Lucky. This would be much more unpleasant otherwise. Not sure how long she'd been out. A minute or 2, probably. She'd fallen quite far. But wizards were resistant to blunt trauma, generally. Some quirk of magical inheritance. Also, Hermione was a troll, a unicorn woman, and rather hard to hurt. Hermione couldn't stop herself from blinking the blood out of her eyes, but remained still otherwise. She couldn't see anything. Unluckily, her face was pressed against a large rock, and it entirely blotted out her view. She listened instead, and waited for her body to finish healing. "Di Sunevi!" What happened? A male voice shouted. A female voice called back in answer, but was too far away to be audible. No mandrakes could be heard, so the soldiers must have killed the exposed ones. She heard a slight crackle as her neck healed, the bones pushing themselves to where they were supposed to be, and drew her breath sharply as the pain of her body screamed through her. An inarticulate shout tore from one of the soldiers nearby, so she had been seen. Well, nothing for it then. Hermione jerked one leg in front of her and pressed against it, spinning herself into a sidelong roll. There was a wash of heat along her back as she did, a missed curse. Nausea assaulted her with the motion, but she ignored it. Her leg wheeled over her spinning body and impacted the rock, and she levered herself up onto it. The spin improbably became a vault, and she landed on her feet in a crouch. It was an act of fluid beauty, and it still seemed unreal that she was capable of such effortless grace. Sharply pointed sleeves, swooping long break in the fabric in the back, stood before her, Their attacks halted for the moment now that she was motionless. She had counted badly, or they'd already restored several of their number. She only saw one of her returned, Simon. He stood nearby, arms raised. She'd saved him, but all of his emotion was concentrated in anger. The fleshy Scot was scowling at the soldiers. He'd been disarmed. That was smart, but neither she nor he had been stunned. That was foolish. The other returned were not visible. They'd probably hit the ground hard, and their emergency portkeys had broken with impact. Her own wand was probably somewhere around here. No matter. The soldiers were watching her warily. They were surprised, but not awed, so maybe the fall hadn't looked as impressive as it had felt. Still, she gave it a try, speaking in clear and awkward syllables.
Saprepe naparadosom. You must surrender.
There was an absolute and complete absence of contemptuous laughter, scornful retorts, or other displays of bravado. Instead, several of the soldiers glanced at one of the tallest among them. Considering the officer, there were no marks of rank visible, and Hermione surmised that this man, who was watching her edgily, was some sort of unofficial leader among the group. He had an impressive chin, broad and cleft. Could a fantastic chin make you a leader among men? Whatever thought process had gone on in the man's mind did not end in Hermione's favour. She could see it in his eyes, once he'd decided. It was disappointing. They must know her. Some of them had even probably seen her in the flesh before, since she'd visited Cappadocia a dozen or more times. But she and Simon were disarmed, and Hermione was a bloody wreck. Hermione thought she must not be impressive enough. She'd better work on her image some more. The more fights she could win without actually fighting, the better. It would make eliminating all the Dementors that much faster. The man aimed his wand at her again and shifted his feet. Other soldiers picked up on the same cue as Hermione, but as they all made ready to fire, she already was diving to the side and plunging her hand into her pouch. Curses flicked over her and behind her as soldiers barked their spells. One curse, a severing charm maybe, opened up her back as it struck her squarely. She didn't know how badly. She was already on her feet, dodging and flinging a glass orb the size of her fist at the soldiers. Big Chin was a quick thinker, and his wand flicked to the side to track the orb as it flew at them.
Redacto!
The orb shattered well before it reached them, the glass. Actually, a perfectly and wondrously thick, hollow, borosilicate glass sphere, courtesy of Transfiguration, detonating as its pressures were released. Big Chin and another soldier were closest, were staggered by the explosion and the wash of warm air that swept over them. Simon, unarmed, had dared only cover his face with his hands. He'd known what to expect and took advantage of the distraction to immediately slap the small of his back with one palm. He disappeared with a wet, sucking sound as his portkey was broken and activated. Hermione dropped to a crouch as the soldiers opened fire again. She rammed her right hand into her left forearm below the wrist. Curses flickered overhead with coruscating light. One brushed her leg, and she lost feeling in it. Even as she went sprawling, though, she was already ripping a slender and gory wand from her left arm, and casting another finite with blood-slick fingers. She didn't have to aim the spell. The air in the sphere had been quite concentrated. If she'd been evil, she would have transfigured acid, though it would have been trickier with the pressure pump and chamber they'd used. This was just water. Water everywhere. In a drizzlingly thick cloud around them, in their mouths, tasting of dust, and in their lungs. Even worse, they'd all taken a few panting breaths over the last 10 seconds or so, respiring transfigured air from what must have seemed like a small bomb. In the lungs of Hermione and 14 other witches and wizards, the alveoli, which clustered like grapes along the bronchioles, had transfigured oxygen into their blood and bound it into red blood cells, which raced down capillaries and arteries. The oxygen was immediately put to work throughout the body in every living cell, producing ATP in 1 trillion mitochondria all throughout their flesh. In an instant, though, a significant percentage of that oxygen had just been reverted back into water. And that was the last thought Hermione had for some indeterminate amount of time.